Hi everyone, this is Richard Koch from Koch SaMD. Welcome to the webinar today. I just need 10 seconds just to make sure everything is up and running. We're live on YouTube and LinkedIn is usually a little bit slower. Just one more second. Okay, we're live on LinkedIn as well. So thanks everyone for joining today. It's a pleasure that you've joined. You could have been anywhere, but here you are. And today we're going to talk about, again, software as a medical device, more or less cloud software as a medical device, and explore the theme of ambition versus competence in a positive way, just to identify lessons that I've learned over the last few years consulting, working on my own project, and what we can do about it. Now, Marvie from Vivid was meant to be here today to co-present. Unfortunately, he's got a conflict, so can't join. So it's just going to be me. But feel free to reach out to Marvie if you need anything from him. So let's go. So the theme today, we're going to talk about the tension between ambitious companies and ambitious entrepreneurs, and basically between their ambition, which we all have, it's nice to have big dreams, where they're starting from, and their competence to achieve the goal. It's really that simple. So before we start, just a bit of housekeeping. These are my views only. Obviously, it's not advice, and it's for educational purposes only. So I'm a consultant, but I only give advice under contract. So a little bit about me. If you've been to these before, that's my product. We just did another release last week, starting to take shape. Come from a finance background in multinationals, spent 5-6 years in analog medtech, startups, a very broad role as CFO, quality manager, supply director, and more or less been in medical device software since about late 2017, 2018, where I launched this product and then started consulting a few years later. And a little bit of marketing. I do run a professional network for medical device software practitioners, charge 90 francs a year. And basically, if you join, we've got weekly meetings every week, face-to-face. You get the chance to network with real SaMD professionals. We have a Git resource for the group. And we're actually working on a build your own SaMD training, or a very practical hands-on going down and up the design V, where participants will get basically full hands-on experience through the whole life cycle using real tools and real code. So we're looking for pilot participants for that as well. So if you join, you might have an opportunity. Anyhow, let's get into it. So what do we talk about when we talk about ambition? Ambition largely means I'm in point A and I want to get to point B. We'll just keep it super simple. That's what ambition is. And competence is more or less our ability to achieve our ambitions. So it's nice to sit at home and think we're going to climb Everest, but you've got to get out there and prepare yourself to get up the top of the mountain. And that competence really is the difference between success and failure. And what I've seen in my consulting experience, ambitious companies, be that startups or large multinationals, are maybe highly competent in some areas, but there are gaps in that competence, which has led to either long frustration, long learnings, failure, waste, all the things that I'm sure some of us have experienced in our life. So what we're trying to do in this webinar is to look at the areas where competence fails a lot of the time and what we can do about it to make sure we can get where we want to go. So when we talk about the ending point, the ambition for medical device software, or in this case, cloud SaMD, there's really two spheres we need to penetrate to get to our goal. The first is we need to set up a business with a functioning medical device quality management system, 13485 certified. And within that, we need to develop our SaMD product, which more or less means two things. We need the technical expertise to be able to develop the code, develop the product, and deploy it. And we also need the technical expertise to build the documentation, the technical file, the regulatory dossiers to support the product registration. So I think this is obvious, but it's definitely worth saying that a well-designed, well-engineered product in the medical device space is meaningless or has no financial value if the technical file and the regulatory dossiers are not compliant. So, and what I see a lot, particularly, which we'll dive into in this space, is that people start coding first, document later, and that can lead to problems with the project. So the next one is that we just discussed the point B, where we want to go. And now let's discuss where people start from. And obviously there's multi-points, but there's three basic areas where, at least in my experience, where people are starting from. So the first one could be someone who's completely outside the medical device industry. So they might have an expertise in a domain or an area. It could be a cardiologist with a good idea wanting to build a medical device. It could be somebody with AI experience and has found a medical use case, but perhaps they've never worked in the medical device industry and know nothing about how medical devices are put on the market. So they have two challenges. They've got to learn about all the regulations and quality management systems in addition to developing their product. So they start from sort of further back in the line, shall we say. The other one, which is more common, is you have companies which already have devices on the market. So you can see the little circle there, physical device characteristics, which does not equal software. So they've got devices on the market, generally not software products, but definitely not cloud SaMD products. So they could have some programmable elements, embedded software or firmware running on devices, but it's not cloud-based SaMD. And that is significant, and we'll dive into that later in the presentation. And so these companies have to do two things. They need to upgrade their QMS to meet the needs of the cloud software. It's generally not such a big issue. And the bigger issue is actually building their first cloud-based SaMD product, their compliant cloud-based SaMD product. And then finally, we have this constellation, which is more and more happening, and strategically for these companies is more and more important, where they may have standalone devices, programmable systems, devices which are not connected to the internet, and they're trying to make these IoT capable devices, which means there's a bit of work to do on the hardware side to make it communicate with your cloud. And then in a lot of cases, they have to build completely new cloud backends and cloud front-end applications like websites and apps. And again, there are advantages and disadvantages to this starting point, which we'll dive into. So they're generally the three constellations I've come across while consulting. Now, so what are the issues that people face? So if we start with the companies that already have devices, non-software based devices, there's really two major categories of problems. The first is to do with their QMS, and the second is to do with their technical files and the operational issues of building their software and building their technical files. So if we look at the top for the QMS, the software development SOP, that often needs to be upgraded. I have a color system here, so green for easy, orange for mid-range difficulty, red for problematic. So upgrading an SOP is not overly difficult, so we'll move on. The next one is in the quality management system, they have to update the roles within that to cover the new roles required from a cloud-based SaMD company. May or may not be difficult, and that's really driven by the problems that they may have with their operational issues in deploying their software, which we'll dive into. So the orange is for may or may not be difficult. But the real problems we have here in the QMS for established device companies is to do with the quality management department's experience with software. Because, again, software is really just another physical characteristic. That's it. But just like you deal with maybe a chemical formulation, different do you deal with, producing a titanium implant, very different physical characteristics. You need to build a skill set around deploying code. Okay, that's hugely important. And there is, a lot of good intention. People get excited, but unfortunately, that ambition, that intention, the motivation often fails if the quality department don't upgrade themselves and learn what's required to deploy compliant and efficient SaMD. And what we see there, we'll touch on in the operational issues, where they force what they know on the cloud teams, and the whole thing falls apart. So, at this point, I see that culturally and professionally is one of the biggest issues. And I have a little bit of a joke. It's maybe a little bit disrespectful, but sometimes in these situations, the quality department becomes the anti-quality department, where even though with the best intentions, they sort of do what they did before, but it really drives poor quality product, non-compliant product. And it's worse than that strategically. You can have big issues for the company as well. If they delays products, it leads to product recalls, etc. We get onto the EQMS systems, or our document management systems, EQMS systems. That's a big problem, because most of them I've seen are not fit for purpose for your technical file toolchain. And we'll dive into that a bit later, but they've just put a pin in. There's a big difference between the toolchain you need to build your technical file documentation and your EQMS system to manage the documents or other things related to your managing your QMS. And that's some fuzzy thinking which can be very easily solved, but again, it's one of these things where people try to enforce on teams tools which are not fit for purpose, and it leads to massive problems for the business as a whole. And the final one there is, and this is it sounds really simple, but this is actually hugely critical. There's a generation of people about my age, so I'm now 51, who grew up in the world where everything was on an A4 piece of paper, or whatever the US size is, and there was no separation between the content on the page and the page itself. So when I was at university, I used to handwrite my essays or my math homework and hand it in to the professor. And it was one thing: you lose a paper, you lose the content. Whereas now, there's a difference. And a lot of the document-based systems, they represent a paradigm which doesn't exist anymore, which is everything is produced in this A4, container, electronic container, which used to be printed on paper in the office. And now generally we don't print too much. Now it's sort of saved as a PDF, more or less. And forcing software teams which deal with very complex architecture, complex code, complex technical files, to force them into these document-based systems, it really breaks the system. And we do understand that you need your PDFs, you need your documents. That's great, and there's no argument there. But that's just how you deploy your final version. But you need a different tool chain, a different mindset for building those documents. And operational issues, again, we've touched on a lot of this. The technical file tool chain generally needs to be the same as what you use to deploy your code, because let's face it, code is just text. And they can build very complex products with millions of lines of code, and they can merge it and deploy it, and it all works. And in some ways, our documentation is easier than that. It doesn't have to compile and work, but it has to be correct. And in my mind, the problem to manage the integration of text is solved with the software development tools, but we just need to expand our thinking and train people on these sort of cloud-based SaMD projects, how to do it. So, once again, this is just another way of looking at the same issue of thinking in documents while you're creating your content is very problematic. And again, I think we've touched this, except just this idea that content and format is different. I think we've probably covered that, but again, just reinforce it. These are where I really see a lot of problems. And the other one is this incremental build of documents. So again, when you're building software, you build it incrementally. You don't, you can't write the whole thing in one place. You need to separate it, merge it, test it, etc. And we can do the same thing with our technical files. And this becomes especially important because when you get into live systems, generally with cloud, you need to deploy probably at least once a month just to keep current, or maybe once a quarter on the slowest, but you deploy a lot, and you need to deploy your compliant code with compliant documentation. And the only way, I believe, to keep on top of it is with this incremental changes to documentation. And the only way to manage that is using software agile tools. The other issue we're facing in the industry at the moment is experienced quality managers. We've got a lot of good developers. We've got a lot of good QA, RA people who understand the regulations, but trying to find the gap, to find somebody who can understand software and the regulations, there's really not a lot of people out there. And we'll talk to the solution for that, but to find somebody on the market who's available, who can step into your R&D team, Soft Cloud SaMD R&D team, without any training, contribute on day one, the chances of finding that person today are very small. So you just need to be aware of that. And again, we'll address that in a second. The other one is leadership cloud experience. So this is not generally the R&D teams, but I'm talking more executive leadership, board owners. And I think what we're seeing here at the strategic level is similar to what happened with the big box stores, like Circuit City and Bed Bath and Beyond. These ones, they were category killers in their day. But then e-commerce came along. Leadership were not expert in e-commerce, and they got wiped out, right? Because they just didn't understand. And if we go before that, Kodak developed the first digital camera, but they got wiped out because somebody else took that technology. And I think in the medical device space, we're very much in that situation that if companies don't get their cloud SaMD strategy up and running and understand the importance of it at the executive level and build those competencies and understanding about how to be a software company, a medical device software company, but a software company, in addition to producing physical devices, my prediction is we're going to see a lot of turnover in the industry, a lot of consolidation and purchases by companies who do get that right. So this is not just a regulatory issue, in my view. This is very much a core strategic issue for the industry. The other one too is that people deal with is this velocity of the projects, and there's certain dynamics there. So unlike traditional physical devices where you have longer R&D cycles, maybe a few years, and then you sign off on your technical file, you hand it over to manufacturing, and manufacturing just produce the same device over and over and over again. So the R&D is very, very small, and there's a very big cutoff between design and manufacturing. So that transfer to manufacturing step is really, a membrane, a separation between the two departments. Now in cloud SaMD, it's a lot faster than that, and there pretty much is no separation between development and manufacturing, because your manufacturing is your release, and then you rely on the technology to perfectly replicate your software. Say it's an app or a website. The technology perfectly replicates that version of your software. So there's no batches, there's no long production, there's none of that stuff. You release, it's available, it runs. And then the development team go back and they start working on the next version, which is another iteration of development. As we said before, this could be monthly, could be weekly. I had one customer who was deploying daily. And if you want to do daily compliant releases, which is very, very possible, you really need to think about running your team like a factory, where you're not thinking about batches being released 3 months ahead, 6 months ahead, like you would on a sales operation plan. You're thinking about releases, versions of your product, maybe a few months ahead, Because if you want to release daily, you need to work back in time, probably 60, 90 days, and have that really well planned out to make sure your code, your environments, and your documentation for every one of those releases are compliant. I think we've touched that point, combined R&D, supply chain, and then resource imbalance. So again, what I've seen, a lot of teams resource very heavily on the developer, engineer side, DevOps side, but they kind of are more weighted on the implementation and build of the software coming up the V, at least to verification. But resourcing coming down the V and managing all of that documentation, all that traceability, all that design is just as big a job often as coding. And teams need to have dedicated people for documentation, managing documentation backlogs, the same skills we use to manage software. And the problem we see is that often people use incorrect tools, Word, for example, and the documentation gets forgotten until just before release. And guess what? Release gets delayed, or they have to recall, or it's non-compliant, etc. And you can't do that. So again, there it's these problems are caused by a combination of tool and resource imbalance. But learning how to resource your team appropriately is important. But I think the R&D guys get it once they see the solution, but convincing your QA/RA department to dedicate somebody, convincing your leadership, etc., it sometimes falls apart, and that leads to, like I said, non-compliant product, and can lead to a lot of burnout and dissatisfaction in the teams as well. Finally, agile ideology. I'll put a green there because agile is good. I'm a big fan of agile. You need agile. But agile ideology, where it's more about the agile culture than adapting agile to the needs of your cloud SaMD, that's where the problem lies. So raw agile in an SaMD context, in my view, won't work. You need to take the principles and you need to push it through your design and development plan and operationalize agile into your culture, into your procedures, etc. But make sure you have tight control over it. Okay. I'll leave it there. That's a longer discussion. So agile is good. It's better to work with teams that have invested in agile coaches, but it can also lead to problems if not managed. So the next one, if we look at the starting point of IoTs. So the QMS, we're going to ignore that. Generally, they've got software development procedures. They need a bit of an update, maybe, but the big issue here is the conflict between the cloud SaMD teams and the embedded teams and the hardware teams, and it's really a cultural issue, again driven from many reasons. One of them is due to do with this sort of engineer mindset, like so electrical engineer, hardware engineer mindset versus maybe a developer, coder, DevOps mindset. And you should be able to bridge it, but I've seen it many times as a problem. There really seems to be a cultural gap between them. They have to work together. There are ways of managing that, which we'll get into, but this engineer, developer, coder, difference can be a problem. It's orange because with the right leadership, it can be solved very easily. The other big one is different velocities. As we said, with embedded software, your rate you can build your code is usually dependent on the hardware you're building it on. So the embedded software guys have to wait for hardware to develop, or they've got their stuff, their kits sitting on their desk. That's fine, but the software can't get ahead of the hardware too much. Whereas for the cloud, we deal with off-the-shelf applications, cloud services. We're using third-party environments. We don't have that constraint, so it's just all about code. You've got to push that code, deploy that code, build the system. So it's really about sprint velocity, closing tickets, merging branches, all this sort of stuff. So that velocity really does play a role in the difference to the teams and sometimes in the culture. The tool chains are different, And by what I mean by that is that for your hardware devices, your embedded software can sort of be seen by as a component in the wider system. So, they still do use, the same tools, but often there's another system in place, like a Polarian or some of the IBM tools, which escapes my mind at the moment. Whereas, with the SaMD, you've got more just your agile tools. So, it's your Gits, it's your ticketing systems, it's your DevOps tools, etc. And there's really no dealing with the hardware. Your hardware is really just a configuration item in your backlog. So again, the tools, and that leads to, I've got it down later, that the ability to trace requirements across components, between cloud components and hardware components in a complex IoT system. There are solutions for that, but at least in my experience, I've never seen a good integrated version of that. There are ways to handle it manually, which I've seen good versions of that. And then we've got test automation. So again, due to this velocity, you need, in my view, dedicated test engineers, because just the time it takes to code your Gherkin scripts or using the test frameworks, that has to be coded on every branch, and then you've got to run your test pack, make sure nothing breaks. So just to maintain your automated code base it's a more or less a full-time job. Okay, I know I've got that. I've got a very small team. I've got one front-end developer, one back-end developer, and just to maintain that, it slows down my velocity, because I've got a decision: do I code new function or do I maintain my Gherkin scripts? And for a big company who can fund it, or somebody who's big ambition, you shouldn't be slowing down your developers working on the product by getting them to do their own testing. So for me, I think you need to resource your Gherkin or your automated testing with your developers. And there's also another really important point there around segregation of duties. So I come from a finance background, and in finance, control, segregation of duties is important. So, the person who approves the payment shouldn't be the person who approves the invoice, for example. And developers, they get deep into the code and they kind of lose perspective, because, it's a very technical thing. And sometimes they need somebody to test, look over the shoulder and say, hey, this went wrong. Can you look at this? Not in a negative way. It's just how it works. So when I'm testing for my developers, oh yeah, this broke, that broke. And there's this law of unintended consequences, where you do something over here and guess what? Something over there breaks, and you learn something about your system. So just having that, backstop quality control is really important. Yeah, again, we've got this, as I discussed before, this, what I call ERP factory, like a manufacturing facility run on an SAP ERP system. And in that factory, your embedded software is loaded onto a chip in the factory, for example, versus agile and cloud, where you just have one version of code, you deploy, and you're out there. And you're not talking about a batch, you're talking about, in a lot of cases, all your customers. Complex traceability, we've kind of touched on that between the systems. Complex interdependencies, talking together, these system interfaces can be managed. And the final one, there's an orange one here, the system regulatory classification. I've seen some very bad examples in my experience where SaMD, with an independent medical function that was also an accessory to a hardware device, has just been classified as an accessory. And I've also seen examples where they didn't use their architecture well enough to simplify their regulatory paths. So that's a whole, webinar in itself, but we'll just leave it there. And with these guys, sorry, we're running out of time, apologize, probably go for another 10 minutes. So apologies if we run over. We've got the people just entering the domain, and the biggest risk here is the unknown unknowns. And, to go through it quickly, they underestimate the effort of doing medical device software, underestimate the cost, learn by doing, which means generally you make mistakes and you have to rework, which you rely on the wrong advice. And unfortunately, I've seen that a lot, where there's a lot of consulting companies out there who charge top dollar, but don't necessarily implement what the customer needs. They implement what they know. And I've got one example at the moment where, you know, a well-known consultancy went in, built their QMS, and, you know, I'm working with another company to fix it. And just by looking at their Confluence, at their Jira setup, you can tell it's just not compliant, right? And look, I'm not going to blame the consultant. They did the job that they were paid for. It's really down to the founders, and we'll touch on that in a minute. Overwhelming workload. You know, I've gone through it myself over the last few years. I consult, and I've also got my own ISO 13485 company, gone through the certification. I have a non-regulated product on the market, which we're getting close to submitting for regulation. And I'm doing pretty much all myself except for the coding. It is overwhelming, let's put it there. So you need a bit of resilience, you need ambition, you need a bit of self-management. And yeah, it looks like a tsunami of work, and it is a tsunami of work. And it can lead to shortcuts, burnout, all these sort of things. So yeah, I'll just leave that one there. Partially qualified team. So again, you see absolute, you know, in the industry, I've never met anybody I don't like. But, you know, and a lot of respect, everyone I've met, I've got a lot of respect for professionally. But, you know, we all have our weaknesses, me included. And, you know, getting that team with the full set of qualifications is really difficult, especially in a startup where you may not have the budget to go wide. So you're relying on people who are learning with you. And again, there's ways to do it, but it's just one of the problems you need to face. And the worst situation is, and there's a lot of these cases, is you learn after the money is gone. So for big companies, you know, for $100 million plus, they can burn millions for years until they work it out. It's not wonderful. But if they've got profitable product lines and they're growing their top line and their bottom line profit, they can hide it and justify it, which is good maybe for the leadership. But again, it hides some of the problems and hides the criticality of what needs to be fixed. For startups, this can be fatal. You run out of money, you go to the market trying to raise money, you've got to take a bad deal. If you're a founder, maybe you lose your percentage, you know, and lose your motivation. So there are some serious life consequences here for getting it wrong for new participants. So what to do? First one is start. I really believe that. In my view, every medical device company should be learning how to code cloud-based products, even if they don't have an idea. As I said, like, you know, we've seen retail, e-commerce took over. Same thing here. You need to know how to code, produce front-end, patient-facing or channel-facing applications. So just start. That's the biggest advice I can give. And then when you get it wrong, give up on what you were doing and restart. So learn. That's really important. And I have a mantra: fail fast, fail cheap, fail early. Somebody said it, we all have to pay the dumb tax when we're learning. If you can optimize the dumb tax to reduce it as much as possible, that's good. So having some self-awareness, some good advisors, and some internal judgment to say this is not working. And it's an awful feeling to say I've got it wrong and I need to stop things and step back from it. I've had to do that personally in my consulting career, in my product, but, you know, it's the only way to move forward. You know, stop doing what doesn't work, regroup, get some good advice, you know, start with more productive output. Build a network of advisors and supervisors. So, sorry, a bit of a silly slide here. If you're going to the moon and you need an astronaut, see if you can find somebody who's gone to the moon before, you know, assuming anyone's gone to the moon, if you've into those conspiracy theories. So sometimes you need, you know, the guy who's done it or the girl who's done it. Sometimes you need the expert advice from maybe a legal or regulatory expert. You need somebody who can get in and fix it, like a very hands-on technical coder, engineer, DevOps person, whoever it is, who can come in and solve technical problems. And I think, you know, more and more in the consulting, I'm really encouraging clients to build a network of individuals. Consulting companies can be good, but like I said, you know, in my view, the big companies, there's a big gap in how to do it well for customers. They have their place, don't get me wrong. And, you know, for big projects, they've got the resource that independents like me can't bring. but have your network of either individual people you can bring in for problem fixing for an hour, for a day, to jump on the call, to bring them in for a week of work, whatever it is, this flexible arrangement, because you never know what you're going to face, and no one person, one company is going to have all the solutions. So that would really be my strong advice there. Toolchain, you've heard me mention that a lot. For me, this is make or break with medical device software. And you've heard me say it before, and I'll say it again. Your traditional document-based way of building your technical files is not going to work in cloud. It's going to slow you down. It's never going to be perfect. Can't control it. Really need to learn how to build technical files using agile tools. And in the medical device software network this morning, we had a conversation on this point. It was more related to CSV, computer system validation, but it's more or less the same principles as building software. And the struggle is, again, between the traditional department with their large SAP document management system, manual Word-based templates, and the need to trace complex requirements from requirements to configuration or code, and then test it for all that traceability. So what I say is your vendor's not going to save you. It's not their job to save you. Their job is to sell you a product and make money. And I'm pretty sure for any product, not just EQMS systems, people will try and sell you anything, sell ice to Eskimos. I support them in that endeavor. It's, why not? But you as a manufacturer need to be smart. And I say, don't buy the promises, like, baby, I'll love you tomorrow. Don't fall for that trick. So don't buy something until you know. And in this case, in your design and development plan, you need strong toolchain requirements, and they need to be constantly evolving. And I really recommend not committing too early. Start manual if possible. And when I say manual, okay, maybe Word in some cases, but start with just raw DevOps toolchain. So things like a ticketing system, Confluence, a Git repo, without any fancy whistles. Just put some manual controls on it until you know what you're doing. And then you're probably prepared to go to the market and assess tools. And I am not a fan of these combined EQMS tools, which say they're agile. In my view, they're not. They're partially agile, but we've got large companies which manage billions of lines of code for large companies, Amazon, Google's, and this, and they're using GitHub, and they're using DevOps, and they're using Jira. Why would you go anywhere else, right? Why would you go anywhere else? And these can be configured for a medical device use case. So that's a really strong one. But what you want to look at with your EQMS, you need to be able to deploy to their QMS, the documents. And I think what you really want to look for there is not necessarily Jira or Git integration. You need to look for APIs that can load PDFs from build agents, right? So you've got your code there, you want to build your PDF, and you want to deploy automatically to your document management system, because, unfortunately with CFR 11, we can't get around the need to approve documents. So, again, that's a whole different workshop. And fail fast, fail cheap, fail often. Encourage that, but learn. You can never learn enough. We've kind of covered this one, differentiate between toolchain and EQMS. As I said, they're separate, but they have to communicate. So deploy from your medical device software toolchain, your documentation toolchain, into your EQMS. So deploy a PDF into your QMS, but creating that document has to be done in an agile way. And here we go, training is really important. So as I mentioned before, it's at the moment, it's really hard to find people with good cloud SaMD medical device experience. In a few years, it will change. And I'm seeing more and more, people who are better fit. But in my mind, there's still a huge gap in the market. So if you're a quality person with a career in quality management, you understand the regulations, you understand the controls, go out and learn software. These tools are free. You can get free versions of Jira, DevOps, Git, etc. You've just got to learn how to use them. and you get very practical hands-on experience on how to write simple software, how to merge it, how to do the documentation. And again, just give myself a pitch. This is what I'm trying to do with the medical device software professional network, is support individuals. So that's a group for individuals, practitioners, not companies. And I'm trying to fill the gap there at a price point they can afford, because, you know, it's easy for me to say, go out there and learn, but where do you start, right? And I think a good place to start is get in contact with people who know it, and we'll show you how to do it, right? But, you know, find people with good skills, good attitude, strong motivation. And I say it sort of comes from two directions. Find a good developer with the right mindset for quality, which means detail-oriented, disciplined. Train them in QARA, okay? They're smart people, they're going to learn. Or find you good, you know, QARA people and train them in software development. And in this stage, you know, there's a bit of joint learning, but bring them into the center, and we need to develop for the industry these skill set of people who can bridge that gap. And like, you know, I'm a big supporter of Swiss medical device industry. This is where I am. Most of my customers are there. And, you know, I really think this is something as a Swiss industry we can really invest in a lot, and help. You know, precision engineering may not be enough for us, well, let's say Papier Schweiz, paper Swiss people, and the real Swiss people. And the final one is educate owners, board, and leadership. This one is so important. So do you remember any of these brands? Circuit City, in the I think the 2000s, they were huge. I used to go to business for the US and go there. Kodak, remember them? I think everybody of a certain age grew up buying Kodak film. There are generations now who probably don't even know that brand exists, I would imagine. Palm Pilot, again, they had their time in the sun where it was cool to have a Palm Pilot, but they lost out on the whole connectivity thing, the smartphone thing. MySpace, again, lost out. Bed Bath and Beyond used to be huge, but didn't transition to e-commerce. And my prediction is, in a few years, we're going to start to see big names in medtech who are going to be on this list, because they didn't get the cloud SaMD right. They didn't produce patient-facing or channel-facing front-end solutions, which are now, well, which are more and more just going to be expected by our medical customers and our patients. On the other side, the big opportunity is for those companies who are doing it now. My view is, if you stretch it to the limit, it almost doesn't matter what physical product you have, what medical device, what indication that is. If you've got a good cloud business, medical cloud, just buy all the products you can and integrate them. It's like the Amazon strategy. You know, Amazon started in books, you know, but they wiped out Circuit City, they wiped out Bed Bath and Beyond, right? Their competence, their strategic advantage was really that electronic distribution. And I think it's the same thing in the medical space, because, you know, I kind of say people aren't really interested in your medical device. They're interested in the benefits they get from the medical device, at least as a patient. You know, the channels in between, they want to make a bit of money, which is fine. But, you know, your device at the end of the day is just a vehicle to deliver medical benefit. And if you can accelerate that benefit, add that benefit, make it easier, functional, emotional, financial benefits, all that sort of marketing stuff through your medical device cloud, and again, build a leadership space there, and build the digital revenues, which are almost 100% margin, right? So to run code on a server is almost, you know, zero marginal cost. You know, this can be a huge source of strategic advantage. So again, you know, I've worked with customers in the dental space, the infusion space, you know, a couple of others, and, you know, no one's really won there yet. And I think, you know, here in Switzerland, at least, we could have a few winners. And definitely, you know, USA is a big space, and others. But yeah, let's make sure that none of us on the webinar end up on this list. So listen, that's the end of the webinar. Sorry I went over a little bit. It really was a lot to cover. If there are any questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat. I'm just having a look now. I can't see any. So I'm always available to speak, so feel free to reach out to me at any time. I'm very happy to speak to anyone to address questions you might have. It's just sort of part of my commitment to the industry, shall we say, and I like this space a lot. If you are interested, if you are a medical device professional looking to connect with other, really, I'm very impressed by the group we've got at the moment, really highly skilled, experienced people. And we're having some very good conversations. Join the network. It's on my website, as I said. I do consult, so if you want to engage with me, obviously you're welcome to do that. Other than that, thank you very much for your time. As I said, I really appreciate you being here. I hope that was useful. And yeah, I wish you guys a good start to the weekend. Okay, bye-bye.